I'm in LaGuardia, headed to Little Rock, Arkansas. I had the honor of serving as the juror for the 56th annual Delta exhibition at the Arkansas Art Center. So they're flying me out to attend the opening. I'll do a slide lecture. Katie's going to join me tomorrow, and we're just going to have fun and have some barbecue and relish the humidity. I am from the South. I love humidity. Humidity is what made me a painter. It's early morning. I am here in beautiful Little Rock, and it is hot. It's humid. I feel that tightness in my neck that comes with humidity, and I'm very happy. I'm dressed in all black because I live in New York City, so I look like a cross between a Greek waiter and a burglar. But it helps me to think about some of the reasons I became a painter in the first place. Humidity is what made me a painter. And I've said this before, as a kid I believed that I could see air, the air around me, the air between things. I also believed that there were two worlds that exist simultaneously. One that we can describe and touch and see, and the other one, an invisible world, the one that bubbles below the surface. And that the job of an artist, our job, is to crack into the heat of that invisible world and try to keep it around a little bit longer. I was in the Met yesterday before I flew here, specifically to look at Hudson River paintings. And what I love and always have about the American South is that it feels less like progress over nature as embodied in those Hudson River paintings, and more like defeat and redemption at the hands of nature. I've talked before that I believe that an artist is born the moment that they give up. I got all the Philip Gustins and Joan Mitchells out of my system decades ago, and I gave up. And what was left over, that weird, desperate, sleep-deprived version of me, was my spark. And I've spent the last 30 plus years fanning that spark. I believe that when you have an attachment to a place, there's a hum. And I certainly feel that every time I'm in the South. This is the place where I learned to daydream, the American South. As I grow older and paint longer, I realize that a lot of things that I took for granted all these decades and didn't even necessarily think about, just sort of put into practice, are so crucial. Very fundamental things like foreground, middle ground, background. I remember my painting teacher in college, Michael Tyzak, a British painter, would talk to me at great length about these things and tell me that they would change as I changed over the years as a painter. And although I listened to him, I also remember thinking that he was being old-fashioned, that I knew what I needed to know. I was 17 and I'd already been painting almost 8 years at that point. I knew where I was going and what I was doing. I was like any inexperienced painter. I was arrogant and cocky, and I knew exactly everything I needed to know. That was my job as an inexperienced painter. When you're starting out, you have the wildness, but not necessarily the chops to deliver that in tenable form. Then when you're experienced, you have the chops, but you want to make sure you maintain some sort of valve into that wildness. Never lose sight of the simplicity of play, of the insanity part. And I do very much believe that a painting is the collision of those two parts. The technical part with the visceral part. So I think the bottom line is that we are all image makers, all painters. All of us construct images. And for me, that very much involves a dedication to the tradition of landscape painting, to the illusory tradition of creating what appears to be a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, suggesting light and atmosphere on a flat surface where there can't possibly be light and depth. So I paint always cognizant of being in the same orientation as a viewer would when they're standing in a landscape, with things at the bottom under your sneakers, the middle ground here, and then the top at the area around your head. And I always, when I'm in a landscape or I'm looking at the paintings that I'm making, I do inventories of that supply chain of space. What's happening in the foreground? How is that different than what's happening in the middle ground? And how will those things in tandem affect what happens in the background? I'll look at Piero della Francesca, and if you look at the way he uses his figures and the objects in his paintings, the way that they look is a function of the distance they are from you, the viewer, from the picture plane. Things in the foreground are very different in their job, in their task, in their conceptual rigor than things in the far distance. It is a very carefully constructed view. And I like very sudden scale shifts in my work, from extreme foreground and then slingshot into extreme distance. That's done mainly through variations of scale, also levels of intensity of color, and also through texture. Thicker paint tends to indicate more terra firma, more foreground, more visceral flesh, where background is more vaporous, further away. And I use the qualities of paint to underscore those tiers of space. The way that I work is I never do outlines of things. I always begin sort of in the middle of where a form might be, and I work my way outward. And when I stop, that is the boundary between that space and the space adjacent to it. That the spatial function happens literally from the inside out, and not based on filling in outlines. Somewhat different than if I talk about somebody like Philips Koenig, for instance, a Dutch 17th century landscape painter. When you look at those beautiful panoramas, he is constructing a view, but it's not as much of an artificial, for me, perspective. It's more about, it's less about a window, in other words, than about the painting kind of serving as a stand-in for the human eye. Which leaves your orientation as the viewer, I think, a little bit more ambiguous. Are we looking slightly up, or from what point are we looking? It's a little less firm than it is, I find, in more of an artificial perspective, like in a 15th century painting. So I find that what I try to do is I go back and forth. I try to incorporate elements of both. The artificial perspective of a Renaissance painting, but also the spatial ambiguity of a Dutch 17th century landscape painting. And I suppose that those boundaries are just as porous for every other painter, that they really are bits of both. It's never one firmly in one. And I think that's what I'm trying to say here is by the time you see this, I will have turned 49 years old. My birthday's on September 18th. And boundaries are not concrete. Things change. I have to pluck a little from here, a little from there. Things are constantly undulating as I move forward as a painter. And I've got the chops. I've been painting for 38 plus years, but I have to make sure I have some sort of electrical connection into that wild part, into the simplicity of play. If you've watched any of my videos, you are probably aware of my fascination with the way that a painting can offer two opposing experiences simultaneously. To paraphrase Jed Pearl, the stability and the instability of a painting. That on one hand, it is a physical object to which we bring our bodies. We examine the rigor of the surface, the painterly facture, the way that the artist manipulates stuff. On the other hand, we are invited into a three-dimensional illusory experience, a fictive world, that through painterly valence, the artist invites us into an imaginary place, a collaboration between artist and viewer. And that the better the painting, the narrower the gap between those two opposing places. If you look at any Rembrandt self-portrait, look at the butteriness of the brushstroke, look at the facility with the paint. But wait a minute, look at the warm blood blood coursing under the translucent skin, under the paleness of the whiskers. But wait a minute, look at the way he uses the oils to glaze and create the glow. It is both things at the same time, both things merged into one third thing that hums. And I often find that the weaker the painting, the more fragmented it remains. Usually because the artist is involved in some sort of other agenda. And I'm not knocking message painting, actually I am, but I do believe that a painting should say everything that it needs to say until there is nothing left to be said. The triage of the experience of a painting for me is a gradual move from a state of fragmentation into a state of wholeness. Boundaries are not necessarily as finite as I once thought. That I find that I am taught by painting how to live, because painting by example is always in a state of wholeness. It is both places at the same time. I find personally that I walk around fragmented, that I'm either focused on my bodily sensations or on my thoughts, but very rarely am I present? Am I both things simultaneously, truly present? And I know this sounds pretentious and I'm overthinking this, but I think as painters, that's kind of our job, isn't it? To try to offer answers to questions that no one is asking. I do not believe that a painting can change the world, but I do very firmly believe that a painting can change an individual, one person at a time, by showing them how to be whole, how to be present. That a painting is eternally immediate. One of my favorite paintings in the whole world is Grant Wood's Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and I've stood in front of that picture for 30 years, more than 30 years, and it has taught me how to be in my footprints, and I can't say it any better than that. Painting does something very special. I'm going to mix some cadmium medium pure with a little bit of alizarin crimson. The cadmium is an opaque color, the alizarin a transparent. So it gives it immediately kind of a nice saturated depth. Then I'm going to bring in a little bit of Payne's Gray, which is also a transparent color. It will deepen it, it will cool it down a little bit, and it will give it kind of a nice kind of tomato-based barbecue sauce color. It's always about food with me. I think that the way a painter ascertains truth is embedded in large part in process, in the way that they handle materials. Indeed, one of the things that links all painters together, regardless of geography or ideology or race, is process, is the stuff. And that what the painter is saying is, come closer. Let's join nervous systems for a minute. I want you to see the world through my eyes for a minute. And that doesn't come through analysis, that comes through play, through the process of play. When Apple said, think different, we invented that. Our job is to monkey around. If you think of Renaissance drawing, for instance, on one hand it might seem very rigid, very academic, but it was also highly experimental. Those artists would tear bits of paper, glue them back together, rotate things into different orientations, take grids apart, reassemble them. Fra Bartolomeo would take little wooden dolls to make his compositions. There's the process of pouncing, where they would use a stylus to prick little holes along the contour of drawing, and then it was dusted to reveal a secondary drawing. If you haven't done that, I recommend it. It is so much fun. The point is that there was always that element of experimentation and play. When I was starting out, before I even knew what painting was, I was always a food player. I still am. I play with food. I didn't even know till I was about 10 that you couldn't eat mud pies. And indeed, my first paintings were made of slimy pluff mud from the marshes of the Lowcountry, splattered out on the dock, and then bits of colored paper, and I would use oyster shells to sort of move the stuff around. When I started using actual paint, I would mix all sorts of things into it: motor oil, salad dressing, glycerin, gelatin, blood, all sorts of things, just to see what it did to the properties of the paint. Up until the mid-90s, I would take the ass end of a brush and stab holes into my canvases to sort of open up another layer of drawing, to re-emphasize the flatness of the surface and the fact that it was an object, and also as kind of a wink-wink to the work of Lucio Fontana. The point is that I never, or hopefully never, lost touch with the process of play. It's so very, very important. People don't look at artists for sound, responsible decision making. They look at us to monkey around. We play because we can.